Imagine owning $33 trillion, a number so large that it's almost incomprehensible. Well, that's the current US debt clock ticking. This massive debt is often compared to a giant Ponzi scheme by experts, and it's not hard to see why. The United States, one of the world's largest economies, is swimming in a sea of red ink. But what does public debt mean? Simply put, it's the total amount of money that a country's government has borrowed. And in the case of the United States, this number has skyrocketed to staggering heights. The implications of this are far-reaching, potentially impacting not just the US, but the global economy at large. From influencing interest rates and causing inflationary pressures to the risk of inducing a recession, the ripple effects of this debt are extensive and worrisome. So what exactly fuels this colossal debt? Let's dive deeper. Welcome back to Money Mind channel, where we simplify the world of finance for you. Now, before we dive into how this debt is financed, it's crucial to understand how we got here. The history of American debt is a roller coaster ride, with the debt ceiling being raised multiple times in the past century. Several factors are responsible for driving up this debt. First off, war expenditures have always played a significant role. From World War II to the War on Terror, military spending has led to substantial increases in the debt. Then there's the matter of economic recessions. During these downturns, the government often spends more to stimulate the economy, while tax revenues fall, leading to higher debt. Another key driver of debt is the government's social programs, like Medicare and Social Security. These programs are essential safety nets for millions of Americans, but they come with a hefty price tag. Lastly, tax cuts have also contributed to the debt. While they can stimulate economic growth, they also reduce the government's revenue, leading to higher deficits. Understanding these drivers of debt helps us grasp the complexity of the issue. It's not just about reckless spending, it's a delicate balance between stimulating the economy, providing essential services, and maintaining fiscal health. Let's move on to how this debt is financed. Stay tuned as we peel back the layers of this financial onion. The US debt is not just a number, it's a complex system. And at the heart of this system is the Treasury bonds and borrowing. So let's dive in and demystify this. The United States finances its debt primarily through the issuance of Treasury bonds. These are essentially an IOU from the government. When you buy a Treasury bond, you're lending money to the government. In return, the government promises to pay you back with interest after a certain period. Think of it as a loan that you give to Uncle Sam. These bonds are auctioned off to the highest bidder, which can be anyone from an individual investor to a foreign government. The demand for these bonds is usually high because they're seen as a safe investment. After all, they're backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. But what happens when the government needs more money? That's where borrowing comes into play. The United States borrows money from other countries, domestic investors, and even its own citizens. This borrowed money is used to cover expenses that exceed the revenue brought in through taxes and other sources. The process of borrowing and issuing Treasury bonds is a continuous cycle. As old debts are paid off, new ones are incurred, keeping the debt clock ticking. It's like a revolving door of debt, and it's this process that has led to the astronomical debt figure we see today. The Treasury bonds and borrowing are the engines that drive the US debt. They fuel the spending that keeps the economy running. But as we all know, there's no such thing as a free lunch. This debt has to be paid back eventually, and that's where things could get tricky. So we've just scratched the surface of the intricate machine that is the US debt. We've seen how Treasury bonds and borrowing play their part in keeping this machine running. But what does this mean for the world? It's time to uncover the potential threats. A ticking time bomb or a manageable burden? The US debt carries potential dangers for the global economy. But what are these dangers and how can we spot them? First, let's look at interest rates. They're like the heartbeat of the economy, and when they start to rise, it can signal trouble. Higher interest rates mean it's more expensive for the US to borrow money, increasing the cost of servicing its debt. This can lead to a vicious cycle where the government needs to borrow more to pay off its existing debt, further driving up the debt pile. Next, we have inflationary pressures. When the government borrows money, it pumps more cash into the economy. This can lead to an oversupply of money chasing a limited amount of goods and services, causing prices to rise. When inflation gets too high, it can erode the value of money and make it harder for people and businesses to plan for the future. Now, let's consider the risk of recession. If the US economy slows down or contracts, it can lead to lower tax revenues and higher government spending on things like unemployment benefits. This can cause the budget deficit to widen and the debt to grow even larger. But what would happen if the US were to default on its debt? Well, it's hard to say for sure because it's never happened before, but most economists agree it would be catastrophic. It could trigger a global financial crisis, causing stock markets to crash and economies around the world to enter into recession. It could also undermine the US dollar's status as the world's reserve currency, leading to a shift in the global economic order. Now that we know the threats, who are the key players in this debt game? The US debt is not a one-man show. It involves a variety of key players, each with their unique roles. One of the most significant players in this complex game is the Federal Reserve, often simply referred to as the Fed. The Fed's primary role is to manage monetary policy, which can directly influence the nation's debt levels. It can increase or decrease interest rates, affecting the cost of borrowing and thus the accumulation of debt. It also holds a considerable amount of this debt, purchased through open market operations, serving as a form of indirect financing for the government. But the Fed isn't the only player holding on to this massive debt. If we dive into the data, we'll find that several countries around the globe hold significant chunks of US debt. For instance, China and Japan are the two largest foreign holders. They invest in US debt because it is considered one of the safest investments in the world, despite the towering figures we're discussing. It's also crucial to draw a comparison between public and private debt to fully comprehend the scale of the issue at hand. Public debt refers to the money owed by the federal government, while private debt is what households, businesses, and private institutions owe. The private debt in the US is also alarmingly high, often overshadowing the public debt. This comparison underscores the fact that the debt issue is not confined to the public sector alone. It's a widespread problem that permeates all aspects of the economy. In the end, the US debt is a jigsaw puzzle with many pieces. The Federal Reserve, foreign countries, and private entities all play their parts. The interplay between public and private debt further complicates the picture. The US debt is a significant issue that we all need to keep an eye on. The US debt, a ticking time bomb or a manageable burden? We've delved into the potential risks from rising interest rates to recession fears. We've identified key players like the Federal Reserve and major debt holders such as China and Japan. We've also compared public and private debt to grasp the scope of the issue. The US debt is not just an American problem, it's a global concern. So stay informed and keep an eye on this ticking time bomb.